filming today for the Hamilton College Jazz Archive in Los Angeles. My name is Monk Rowe, and I'm very pleased to have Steve Allen with me today. I would introduce all the things you've done, but that would probably take most of the interview.
In that case, I'll be running along.
Please, not yet. But I would like to see if we could talk a bit about your involvement in jazz music today. Your upbringing in vaudeville with your parents and so forth has been pretty well documented.
Mm-hmm.
Can you recall the first kind of music that made an impression on you?
Yeah, there were probably three loose-edged stages accounting for the development of my musical tastes and preferences. The first factor is that I was very lucky, given that I would eventually be a composer, a very busy one too, even to the present moment. Because I grew up in the true golden age of American music, and in fact world music. I don't know how many Americans know this, and of those who know, I don't know how many care. But in that golden age, you heard the best American music, all the Gershwin, Kern, Duke Ellington, Hoagie Carmichael stuff, all over the world. To take a specific date, in 1958, my wife and I were in the Soviet Union for about a 2-week study trip. And we were put up in Moscow at the Ukraina Hotel, an enormous and rather ugly establishment.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, we went down to the dining room for the first day's dinner, and all we were interested in was food. But as I got near the entrance to the room, I was pleased to hear music. I thought, oh, a nice extra plus. I wasn't even counting on this. And then as I got still closer, I realized they were playing American music. Now, it wasn't to welcome us. They didn't know who I was. And there were probably 800 people in the dining room at the moment, so they couldn't be, playing Philippine music for Filipinos and American music for... That was out. But what they were doing for the next hour or so, a little 6 or 7 piece group, they weren't playing jazz, although one guy was almost in the jazz area. They were just playing songs that they obviously loved to play, and the great majority of them, and this was at the height of the Cold War, when American culture in general was more or less spat upon by the officials there. Nevertheless, these guys were playing golden age stuff, Irving Berlin songs and George Gershwin songs and Jerome Kern songs. So I had a big smile on my face all through dinner. The food itself wasn't that great, so
So that was the plus.
maybe the music was a distraction.
You can almost bet that they learned those songs off black market recordings too.
Probably, yeah.
That the sheet music wouldn't be available. And
Sometime, if we have more time, I'll tell you about an album that I smuggled into the Soviet Union at that time, and I didn't have to smuggle it. It was just, in my underwear. I didn't have to swallow it and reconstitute it with water later or anything. But do you want me to tell you the story
Yeah,
now?
I'd love to hear
Since
that,
it's about jazz?
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get back to me anytime. Leonard Feather, the noted jazz critic, got in touch with me. We were friends anyway in New York. And he said, I hear you're going to be in the Soviet Union in a few weeks. I said, yes. He said, would you be willing? He said, there might be some slight risk, but I don't think so. He said, would you be willing to take in an album that I would like to get delivered to the people who wrote the music? And I said, yeah, I'll just pack it in my suitcase. And what do I do then? How will I know who they are, where they... So he said, well, you might not be able to reach them, he said, because that is a police state. But he said, at least you can try. And he said, there are always people over there who, despite the government's official line, like Americans and are willing to be civil. And some of them are hip, and they know the name of the local clubs where any jazz might be played. And if you could get to any of those clubs or talk to any people familiar with those clubs, and mention the name of these 2 musicians, and he gave me a piece of paper with 2 Russian gentlemen's names on it. He said, you might be able to make contact. I said, fine, I'll try it. And the music had been written by these 2 fellows, I should explain that. It had been recorded in the United States, and they had never heard it, and at the time it was apparently difficult to just mail things. I don't know why it was, but so I was told. So when we got to Moscow, after hearing that American music was, okay to be played there, I didn't get to talk to those musicians in that band that night, but after a few days with our official guides, who seemed very relaxed and pleasant, I began to ask about jazz, and in Moscow at least, and the word was, well, it's officially, frowned upon, but it happens, which happens with many things in life that are officially frowned upon. So I got the names of 2 or 3 clubs, and they said they're not like jazz clubs in Paris or New York. They're just places where maybe a couple of nights a week some people come in and play a little jazz. It's, the word jazz is not on the outside of the club. They gave me the names, the Red Rooster, How's Your Truck, or whatever the places were called. And so one word led to another, one contact led to another, and I finally was able to meet, I'll try to shorten the story, finally was able to meet somebody who said, yeah, I know who those guys are. And I said, great, big progress. Could you give them a call and tell them I'm here at the Ukraina, and I have an album I'm told they'll be very pleased to hear, and they'll have to take it from there because I don't know how to get to them. He said, fine. So a couple of days later, the phone rings at the hotel, my room, and a fellow, speaking naturally with a Russian accent, said, Mr. Allen? I said, yes. He said, I am, whatever his name was, I'm downstairs with my friend, the other man's name, and he said, we understand you have something for us. I said, I certainly do. What a pleasure to hear from you. I said, come on up. He said, no, we can't. You couldn't go to a foreigner's room in those days. Oh. The police would talk to you about it. So I said, fine, I'll come right down. And we did a little description of each other because I don't think they knew who I was. They didn't see my shows in the Soviet Union. And the Benny Goodman Story hadn't gotten over there yet and so forth. So I said, I'll be right down. I'll be carrying an album. That'll be one way you'll recognize me. And anyway, I went downstairs. Now here's a weird part of the story. There were maybe visible at the moment I descended the stairs 250, 300 people. It's a big hotel with an enormous lobby. This is if you were in any big hotel. And believe it or not, I picked the guys out immediately. You might say, they weren't wearing zoot suits or, carrying trumpets or, any cartoony factors that might have accounted for my quick recognition. They just looked hip.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird?
Even in Russia.
Yeah, even in Russia. And then this was 1958, again, Cold War time. So I couldn't be sure that was them because somebody could have looked hip and been with the KGB, as something to throw me off. Send our hippest man. We got an American on the line. But sure enough, it was them. They came up and smiled, and they spoke some English. I spoke only about 3 words of Russian, so we worked in English. And I gave them the stuff. And that's about the end of that story. Anyway, now we jump way back to in my childhood, and that was the time when all of this great world music was being created by the names. They're still so well known, I don't have to recite them again. And there were no car radios in those days, but I spent a lot of time in the car with my mother and my stepfather. They were performing in vaudeville. And I remember clearly, at the age of 4 or 5, 6, what we used to do is sing. And you could only sing what you've heard. Well, I guess you could make up a song and sing it, but the people with you would be in trouble. So we would do the popular hits of the day, unaccompanied by any musical instrument. And it was great brainwashing. Again, at the age of 6, I didn't know that I would end up being a professional composer, but given that I was headed that way, isn't it nice that I heard all those wonderful songs sung by my mother and my stepfather? Then, in about 1936 or 7, the biggest guy in the music business, as far as the majority of Americans were concerned, this had nothing to do with jazz, but it had to do with good music, was a piano player named Eddie Duchin. I didn't expect you to have any of his albums in your library, and you shouldn't, because he knew nothing about jazz, never played a note of jazz in his life. But he was a good step leading people to good things because he had marvelous taste. He was also handsome, and he wore tails and was, had love affairs, and they made a movie of his life starring Tyrone Power, I think. But Duchin is still remembered, even if people don't remember him. Today's teenagers, if they get at pianos, can sometimes play those old styles of introductions. A lot of Eddie Duchin's arrangements started with that piano intro. So any American kids who were interested in the piano could either play chopsticks, could play both chopsticks and the Eddie Duchin intros.
Similar to Heart and Soul.
Yeah,
that intro.
exactly.
Yeah.
The first
Yeah.
16 bars of Heart and
Right.
Soul. None
Right.
of us ever knew the bridge.
It has a nice bridge.
It has a great bridge,
Yes.
but the bridge is real composition. The
Yes.
other's pretty lightweight music, although it's a nice song and it deserves to be a hit and a standard. But anyway, every American kid, like later they wanted to be Elvis Presley or Mickey Mouse or whoever American kids at one point or another want to be, a lot of us wanted to be Eddie Duchin in those days.
Oh.
And parenthetically, I've run into maybe 200 guys with us in a certain age bracket since I did the Goodman movie who told me that when they were little they wanted to be Benny Goodman, or they decided it would be nice to be Benny Goodman after seeing the movie because they got here a little too late to see really Benny himself. His records were still available, of course. So anyway, that was the phenomenon. He was the biggest thing in the business, and he was a role model for us, to use that common phrase. Now, we're jumping about different places in my 77-year-old life.
Mm-hmm.
I was coming back from Los Angeles, to which I had advanced when I ran away from home in Chicago at 16, stayed away for a year, eventually came back and entered a high school, public high school there called Hyde Park. It was there I met Mel Torme, he was another student, and some other guys who did not go on to become well known, but were into jazz, were interested in it and could play it, starting to learn, working with neighborhood dance bands and stuff. And it was there that I got interested in jazz, just listening to records at these kids' houses. Before that, I had of course heard jazz and enjoyed it. You might say, well, how could you be hearing jazz and enjoying it without being sort of emotionally involved with it? The explanation of that seeming paradox is that jazz, as you know, was middle-of-the-road music. Everybody loved jazz. Even people who were classical musicians loved jazz. They didn't know how to play it, but they liked to go like that when, dancing and whatever. Jazz was all very rhythmic and harmonically much simpler than it later would get in the 50s. But I liked it, but I had never somehow had it open up to me. I was still into melody. I was a melody freak and still am as a composer and as an appreciator of other composers. So suddenly it was just the social contact. The other kids at school knew about jazz. I didn't, but within about a week I was turned on to it. Began listening to Ellington records and Basie records and Erskine Hawkins and Fletcher Henderson and all the good jazz bands of that day. I'll be right out. Somebody's on the phone. Yes, come in and change my clothes, please, while I'm on television. Gee. That's the maid. We're here at a hotel, folks.
Yes. Well, we'll keep talking here for a moment. Is there, you mentioned the music of the Golden Age as being mostly superior to what's going on today.
Oh, forget mostly. It was
Okay,
superior.
It was superior.
That settles that, folks.
What parts of the music, in your opinion, became less emphasized after the Golden Age, or more emphasized?
Okay, for historical reasons, we should probably specify some arithmetic when I refer to the Golden Age. It was a roughly 30-year period, the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. So that brings us up to the middle of the century, 1950, 49-50. And oddly enough, it was right at that point, right smack in the middle, that American taste went right into a deep ravine or canyon from which it has never fully emerged. That is not to say that there was no good music after that medium point. Of course there was. There wasn't nearly as much of it, and for the most part it wasn't as good as the giant oeuvre of Cole Porter and Irving Berlin and Richard Rodgers and all those giants. They really had the gift of melody. Unfortunately, seems to me unfortunate, it is possible to write songs without having that gift, because there are certain mechanical things, cliche things, harmonic cliches you can employ. And if somebody said, I'm going to play some chords at the piano, and then you'll notice, yeah, thank you, bring that refreshment right in here. Good.
All right.
I'll get this book out of your way. If somebody said, I also have a gun in my hand, and I am going to shoot you. You'll say that's a crazy thing to do. Yes, I'm going to do it because I'm crazy. I'm really going to shoot you unless you can avoid death. But I will shoot you unless, to the accompaniment that I will play on my piano or my guitar, you improvise a little melody. Everybody would do it, even people who are tone deaf. You don't want to get killed, so you'd... And it is just such melodies that are now on the radio and have been for 20 or 30, 40 years. It's not that tough to write a simple song. In fact, it's easy. I've written, by the time this gets on the air, my total output will be about 8,000, literally. I once wrote 400 in one day. So it's like some people can wiggle their ears. I can too if I hold my fingers, but I can't do it without the finger. I can write all the songs you want. Big deal. You know, it's not even work for me. It's just easy to do. So what? Where were we? Oh yes, the superiority of the again the Gershwins and the Johnny Mercers and all those great writers, Gus Kahn and everybody knows the names, or they can look them up. Was the songs were highly melodic. Now that is almost a meaningless term if you're talking about only melodies, as a result of which nobody ever does talk about only melodies, not since Gregorian chant or something of, you know, where a guy was singing a cappella. Oh, that's a melody, but it's not very interesting. And nobody ever went nuts about it thinking, oh yeah, I remember I was my first girlfriend. We went, ooh, it'd be nuts if you did that. But when you take a melody and wrap it in harmonics, then the result is true beauty if you did it right. And we had a lot of composers in the old days who could do it right. In addition to the 20 giant names that are known, there were other people who wrote just as good music, but maybe only wrote 2 or 3 songs, or they didn't have a publicist or whatever. Parenthetically, one of the greatest composers of the Golden Age was a man named Harry Warren, and probably a lot of people listening to me right now will say, Harry who? He just never became well known, even though he wrote probably 30 of the most beautiful songs and most popular songs of that day. So now, at your request, I'm making a distinction between the Golden Age material and stuff since then. Let's talk about the good stuff since then, so people don't misunderstand my point. They will anyway, but that'll make it a little less likely. The first breakthrough composer after 50 to suddenly be original and richly melodious and great was Jimmy Webb. By the time I get to Phoenix and a lot of other good songs about that time. Then, I'm not sure I have these in chronological sequence, but another one who then showed up was Burt Bacharach, who gave us about a dozen of the best songs ever written. I got angry the other night, last night I guess it was, watching 60 Minutes. They did about a 15-minute tribute or coverage of some kind of Burt Bacharach. And they were talking to some people who didn't seem to know enough about music, in my opinion, to have been called to provide that service. Burt Bacharach's songs, his good songs, are great. I don't mean they're pretty good compared to something else. I mean they're as good as music, popular music gets, and they're also very individual. A lot of pretty songs, you really couldn't tell for sure who wrote them. Thank God for them. They're still glorious music, but they're not stylistically unique. Whereas mostly, if you hear a Burt Bacharach song, you can be sure it's pretty. You can be pretty sure that it was written by Burt. Then Henry Mancini provided several lovely melodies. Billy Joel has given us some lovely things. So guys have come along, and out of the Beatles, we got maybe 7 or 8 good songs. So there are these post-1950 examples. But if you add up all that stuff in one big blender, it's just not as good, with a few individual song exceptions. It's not as good as the Golden Age stuff. We're talking about it in a general, averaged-out sense.
Do you think technology had anything to do with that? The advent of first electric guitar, then later on, of course, drum machines and synthesizers and computers.
An interesting question. Yes, it had something to do, certainly, with the sounds. And when I do that, I'm not putting the music down. In another context, I am putting the music down. But listeners, for the most part teenage kids who buy most of the records, are interested in a sound, a unique sound. Usually it's a highly rhythmic sound, although it can be the voicings of instruments or the unique sound of a given human voice. There's something about it which enables them to be interested or fascinated, as the case may be, with a given piece of music. And that has become more common since the 1950 point. Why? I don't know. I could come up with answers, but we're busy at the moment.
Yeah. We can take a pause for our coffee here.
All right. Thank you. Another of the great composers of the post-1950 period is Michel Legrand. Beautiful stuff. Another of the best, really great composers of the recent decades is Antonio Carlos Jobim and some of his fellow South American composers. It was Jobim who brought back melody into American popular music when it had been pretty well cast aside. There were many little digressive routes down which the fans flocked after the 50s. Sometimes it was the people they were following, the Pied Piper was a given performer. Elvis, for example. Except for Lieber and Stoller, who knew what they were doing and deliberately wrote down, dumbing down, away from Gershwin, away from Jerome Kern, dumbing down and created songs like You Ain't Nothing But a Hound Dog and Keep Off of My Blue Suede Shoes. I don't know all of those songs they wrote. But they were deliberately writing for Elvis. Elvis, I was able to be of help to him early in his career. I've always liked him. He was a good, unassuming guy. Got to be the biggest thing in the history of show business, and it really never went to his head. Every time I'd see him, if you can believe it, he would say, "Nice to see you, Mr. Allen." Imagine calling me Mr. Allen when he was God in the industry. But that was typical of him. He was always a nice country boy, whereas some performers who, if you went to high school with them and later you meet them, forget it. It's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But Elvis was always consistent and nice, and the biggest. So you're not going to write for him songs that you would write for Frank Sinatra or Ema Sumac or a lot of other more talented singers. What Elvis had was not an enormous talent in the traditional sense of that word, in the sense that Mel Torme had a glorious singing sound and was the hippest, probably white singer, and maybe colorless, maybe just the hippest singer of all time. He had that is talent. Barbra Streisand is talent. We all know what talent is. Elvis was not in that category. He had something, in terms of popularity, more important than talent. You're probably thinking, what could be more important than talent? So I'll tell you, if the purpose is to make it, he had star quality. Star quality is not the same as acting talent. A lot of very fine actors are character actors and will never be stars in their lives. They give you realism and you love them in the movies, but they don't get fan mail. Women don't run after them down the street. Elvis had that mysterious thing. Marilyn Monroe had it. Clark Gable had it. There are various people you could name. And again, to get back to Elvis, he definitely had that. So he deserved his success, if any of us deserve anything. But he was one of the reasons for the erosion of taste, because he was so fascinating. He could sing and people would say, "Hey, give me that garbage," but they would love it because he did it.
Was the change in musical tastes, and I'm kind of steering back towards jazz now, totally the fault of the audience, or did the musicians and the producers have anything to do with
all of the above? Yeah, a very good question. I love all kinds of jazz. I love some kinds a little more than the others, but I've never heard jazz where I would say, that is rotten, get rid of it. I just love jazz, boom. But one form that I enjoy, which is bop or progressive or bebop, is clearly, I don't know if anybody else ever thinks this, but I'm right. We're not going to send out for a vote, folks. Trust me, I'm right about this. That wonderful form of music left all of America's teenagers, all the 17-year-olds, around the corner and down the road because you can't dance to bop. I guess there must be a few tunes that are boom, 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 you know, that you can dance to. But you can't dance to Night in Tunisia
Right.
or a lot of the great stuff.
Uh-huh.
The only one of the bop or progressive stars or noted players who was such a genius and so melodic that in his case it almost didn't matter because his soul roots were really back in the beautiful days when he was growing up. He was hearing beautiful music, and that's Charlie Parker. Charlie Parker, as you know, you probably know a lot more about the history of jazz than I do, played such beautiful solos, even on very fast renditions of tunes, that a group called Super Sax has made a lot of beautiful albums. I recommend them to everybody, where they simply took note for note, they wrote out a Charlie, as you know,
Yes.
a Charlie Parker solo, and then voiced it for 5 saxophones. So Charlie himself was the least to blame for the Goodbye Teenagers thing, but they went from, they went into country, they went into Frankie Avalon type, you know, let's all make a movie about going to the beach and see the girls in their bathing suits music. So there are a lot of reasons why jazz veered off from the popularity it enjoyed for centuries, or I mean decades. I gotta get some blood sugar so I won't say words like that.
New York in the, let's say, the late 50s, when you got to do your TV shows, did you have the initiative or the power to say, look, I want jazz musicians on this show?
I did, and now and then I said it, but the nice thing was I didn't personally have to bring it up at all. There was always a well-trained segment or cadre of the professional jazz musicians who were really trained professional musicians. There were some exceptions, guys who couldn't read music, but they were so great they got by. They couldn't sit in with a lot of bands because you got to play that arrangement if you're with Woody Herman's band. But as soloists, they were great, and they had their own personality. But most of the guys had spent years playing with Benny Goodman or Woody Herman or Buddy Rich or Jan Sabat and his Top Hatters or some band, the Dorsey Band, the Jimmy Dorsey Band, Tommy Dorsey Band. And consequently, you put a piece of music in front of them, they can play it right now. It had to be that way. They couldn't, if you're doing a TV show, you have to play it right. You're on the air that night. There can be no saying, can I come back Thursday and try this again? No, get out of the show business if you're that inferior. So they all stayed in show business because they were great. Some of them were never distinguished as soloists. Others were sensational as soloists. But at least they could play in the Basie Band or the Goodman Band or any of the big name bands, Glenn Miller, whoever, and do well in those categories. So to respond to your question more directly, when it came time to provide me with musicians, with a band on one show or another, just if they looked out the door and whistled, almost all the guys that showed up were the standard studio musicians in New York. I don't know, maybe there were 400 or 500 of them, and a lot of them were interchangeable. Sometimes people who hear a phrase such as the Benny Goodman Band or the Count Basie Band imagine, if they don't think very clearly about the matter, that it was the same 15 guys for 47 years. They were lucky if it was the same guys for 9 weeks, because one trumpet player would quit or hurt his foot or get drunk or something. They were always coming and going in those bands. Consequently, one of the best albums I ever did was done in connection with the Benny Goodman movie. A record producer, a lot of chops in jazz, named Bob Thiel, died not long ago. He said, let's do a Benny Goodman album with you. And he said, but you play a piano solo every place where Benny played a clarinet solo, which is a clever idea. So we did, and it's a swinging album. And the reason I mention it in the context of this point is that everybody in that album, everybody who played in my band that day, had played with Benny Goodman. So it was, in that legitimate sense, a Benny Goodman orchestra. And that sort of thing was quite common.
On the Tonight Show, you seem to have brought some of that vaudeville aura right onto the show, especially with Bob Rosengarten responding to some of the things that would happen either spontaneously or
Yeah.
sometimes set up.
Very little. Well, if we did a sketch, obviously that's set up. You don't suddenly find cowboy hats if you don't write a sketch and order the hats. But the rest of it was all spontaneous, ad-lib, as a talk show has to be. We didn't get as much chocolate on our fingers in those days as we do now, but a finger with chocolate on it actually tastes good. Just don't go too far. You hurt yourself. Yeah, the shows that I did, as we
Napkin,
talk,
Tim?
yeah, could we have a napkin or a towel from the ladies' room or whatever you have? Thank you. The shows that I did always had a sort of a hip jazz club atmosphere. That's partly because of my own love for jazz and participation in it. And secondly, I would never dream of saying that my version of The Tonight Show is any better than anybody else's. That's always a matter of taste. But there are certain factual statements about it we can make, and that was that, thank you very much, that my versions of those shows were hipper, partly because we paid more honor to jazz. Can you imagine, David Letterman saying, our main guest tonight is Scott Hamilton? Of course not, you know. In the days when I did the show, you could.
Yeah.
We had all the jazz great. The only jazz great we never had, I still don't remember why, thank you, was here at Stroud's, we have a sale on, no, I'm kidding. We had all the jazz guys. The ones we never had, the only one I never had was Charlie Parker, and I don't recall why that happened. Maybe he was out of town when we tried to get him. But anyway, when we would book a jazz giant, Art Tatum or Earl Garner, whoever, we would not only let him do a number, obviously you'll do that, we would let him do 2 or 3 numbers, take about a 20-minute slice of time, and sit in with our band, or if he brought his own, he could play without our group. And then sometimes after they would do their 2, 3, or 4 numbers, then our gang would roll in a second piano, and I would sit in with the band. A guy came up to me in an airport a few years ago after he recognized, and he said, I just wanted you to know, Mr. Allen, I really love your album with Art Tatum. I laughed when he said that, because to me that sounds like the guy said, I just saw the films of your fights with Muhammad Ali. Beautiful, you know. And I said, sir, thank you, but you must have somebody else in mind. I never made an album with Art Tatum. He said, well, it's funny you should say that because I have the album. And so I got so interested in his air of certainty that I took his address and we exchanged letters, and he was right. We were both right. I never did an album with Art Tatum, but realizing that Tatum was a genius and would only pass this way but once, as we say, there were people recording his performances off radio guest shots and television guest shots. About the legality of that, I don't know anything, but in an artistic sense, it's nice that it happened, because we now have a lot of recordings we never would have had otherwise. And so this was one of those nights on The Tonight Show when we had the great pianist, and he stretched out at great length, and then they rolled in a second piano. So we traded choruses for very long. I think we must have played for 6 or 7 minutes on the one track, the old tune "Fine and Dandy." Boom, 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 do, 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 do. Sometimes it's a vaudeville cliche of entrance music, but it also swings.
Oh yeah, I didn't even know that was the name of that song. Da, da, da,
oh really?
Da, da, da. Thank you.
Yeah. Anyway, so there it is, a jazz album with Art Tatum and myself. If you can play jazz and if you have a great rhythm section, you sound good. You don't sound as good as Art Tatum. And later I would do that with other people. My favorite pianist of all time, and a dear man too, was Errol Garner, who couldn't read a note of music. He was just a genius. At the age of 4, his genius was recognized. And we could talk about him sometime for 6 hours. I love every note he ever played. But again, there's a recording of Earl Garner and myself playing "The One I Love Belongs to Somebody Else," boop, but so forth. Swings like mad. But I never would have, if somebody had said, listen, we want to get you and Earl into a studio to record, I would have laughed at him and said, please, leave the man alone. I'll only slow him down.
Were you able to get a a copy or a cassette of
Yeah,
that?
if
of
you'd
the
like
Tatum
either
thing?
of those tracks, I can get them for
Oh,
you.
yeah, that'd be terrific.
Sure. In
Wow.
fact, let me make a note of that.
Okay.
Daryl or Jim, find the old tracks where one is from an Art Tatum album consisting of recordings made off radio and TV shows, and the two of us are playing Fine and Dandy. Then we also have a track where Errol Garner and I are playing The One I Love Belongs to Somebody Else, and we'll get those recordings to the Hamilton folks.
Terrific.
Great.
When the Goodman movie came up, did you have to audition for that? Or was that something that they said, this is the guy?
Yeah, by the time the thing was brought to my attention, it was a firm offer. We'd like you to do the picture.
Yeah.
I later heard partly how that came about. We will never know, at least I never knew, how long the casting list was. I'll explain briefly to people who might not know about the movie business that whenever you have a script ready to go, or whether it's based on a famous novel, a play, or something your sister wrote last Tuesday, whatever it is, you don't just call up somebody and say, get me Tom Cruise, or get me Bill Clinton, or whoever. You make out a list, because although you might like to have Tom Cruise in your movie, maybe you're $10 million short and he's not available. There was a lot of reasons he's not going to do it, because he has his next 7 pictures already scheduled, whatever. So you make out a list. Well, if I can't get Tom Cruise, how about John Travolta? If he's not available, whoever,
Yeah.
So we'll never know whether my name was 9th on the list or was number 1 on the list. I don't know. The only other name that I ever heard was in contention was Tony Curtis. And Tony and I are obviously not the same individual. He's a very handsome fellow, and he had the advantage of that at that time he was under contract to Universal, which I never was. So he was a sort of one of their stock leading men. And I've been told that some people at the studio wanted him to play the lead, but that was vetoed by Benny himself, who I've been told said, I'm just paraphrasing, of course, I wasn't there when he said it, said, I want Steve Allen for this because, first of all, Tony doesn't know anything about music, and he won't seem real, he won't seem legitimate as a musician speaking. Also, what can he do with the clarinet? Might as well hand him a tractor. He doesn't know anything about it. I'm punching up Benny's dialogue, but that was the thrust of his message. And the other thing was a little less flattering. He said also, Tony Curtis is a pretty boy. He said, I'm not a pretty boy, and Steve Allen's not a pretty boy. And it turned out that I did look more like Benny. Tony looked nothing like him.
Yeah.
So that had a lot to do with it.
I understand Sal Yeager came out and gave us some.
As soon as I agreed to do the movie, then of course the question was, even though I was a musician, I knew nothing about the clarinet, so we had to hire somebody to teach me, and somebody knew about Sal. Our mutual friend Bobby Rosengarten once said something hysterically funny. He described Sal Yeager as, quote, the Jewish Benny Goodman.
Wait a minute now.
For you young people, Benny himself was Jewish. But anyway, Sal was the perfect choice, and a very easy guy to work with. So he gave me several weeks of just basic lessons, how to hold it, how to blow, and all that stuff. And the reason I did have to go through all that, some people have said, well, why did you bother? Why didn't you just go like that and pretend to play? The answer is, my fingers had to be on the right holds. Now, if you're taking a shot from the back of a ballroom, it doesn't matter. You can hardly see my hands. But on a close-up, I can't be playing this if the real notes are over here. So I did have to have my fingers there, and that meant I did have to learn the instrument. And I learned it well enough to do a little playing in public. I once played a duet with Benny himself on a little tune I'd written. Benny himself that night was in a fog as usual. Benny Goodman lived in a fog. He was Mr. Absent-Minded and often didn't know what he was doing. He'd walk on stage with his fly open and stuff. And through accident, he was just a careless man who didn't think much about the world. Just the greatest clarinet player of them all. So just after the movie, NBC and Universal Studios got together to do a little promotion going in both directions. So that meant booking Benny on our show, which was on the air Sunday nights at NBC at the time. So Benny himself played for a few minutes, and naturally it was thrilling as always. And then our production group decided that Benny and I would do my little song with two of us playing clarinets. It was sort of a riff thing. Boodly-a-bop, beedly-a-bop-bop, ting-ting, beedly-bop-bop, beedly-bop-bop, an easy thing to play. So in the script, I walked in after Benny had played his marvelous numbers, and I said, Benny, that was terrific. And his line was, well, thank you, Steve. Say, I see you brought your clarinet. Why don't you and I do something together? Pretty simple line, and he had a whole week to work on it. He had one line with a week to work on it. And he forgot my name. Now, it was my show. I was playing him in the movie. You might figure if there's any name he wouldn't forget, it's mine. You know, he might have forgotten his own. But anyway, he did on the air, and he did what he always did, because he was always forgetting people's names. He had the world's worst memory for names. One night, he, parenthetically, I'll tell you about his memory, he was doing a performance somewhere, and his usual pianist, who was Teddy Wilson, the great black pianist,
Yes.
was not available that weekend, so he wasn't at the instrument. I don't know who the other guy was. Let's say the other man was just Stacy, although it wasn't, but it was some white player.
I think it was Johnny Guarneri, actually.
Ah, thank you. Then you know the story. Yeah.
Well, I want you to tell it, though.
Okay. So Benny is saying, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and I'd like to also share the thanks with our great drummer, Mr. Gene Krupa, and the king of the vibes, Mr. Lionel Hampton. Now he turns to the white piano player and says, and at the keyboard, Teddy Wilson, ladies and gentlemen. That was the only name he could come up with. So that's how Benny was about names. Anyway, back now on my
back to
show,
your show.
30 million people watching. In those days, you did have an audience that large. So I said, Benny, that was fantastic, really beautiful. There's about a 2-second silence, and then he says, oh, thank you, Pops. Say, why don't we do something together? So that was the name he called his grandmother Pops, and anybody, you know, if he couldn't think of a name, he called them Pops.
That's terrific. I wanted to ask you about your songwriting.
Mm-hmm.
Quite prolific. Got some, and as you said, you're a melody person. Do you approach songwriting differently if you are commissioned or have a very specific intent for a song?
Yes, of all the ways that you can approach and complete a song, I work in all of them. If there are, let's say, 10 ways, it doesn't follow that I do 10% way A, 10% way B. I don't think there are any relevant statistics on that point. But it depends on what the assignment is. Sometimes I function as only a composer, and somebody else provides the lyrics. Or sometimes I function as only a lyricist, and somebody else writes the melody, obviously. In many cases, the majority of cases, I write both. But take a number, Gravy Waltz, the melody of which had already been written by Ray Brown, the great bass player, and nice man, too. Anyway, there was already that cute little melody, boo ba doo boo 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 bee ba doo boo, which itself, oddly enough, was a little riff, partly based on a lightweight song of the 1930s called "The Umbrella Man." Anyway, starting with that little thing, he did an interpolation and wrote a marvelous jazz waltz. So it was my assignment to provide the lyric for that. And it was a little tougher than often because the title was already there. I couldn't suddenly come up with a new thought like, how's your sister, does she have a blister? You know, I couldn't come up with anything new like that. It had to be Gravy Waltz, which is kind of tough because waltzing is one thing and gravy is another, and they have no connection whatever. So I wrote a lyric as if speaking in a sort of a African-American sensibility.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty mama's in the kitchen. So I paint a picture of a woman in the kitchen, and anyway, the lyric was justified in the song and finally won a Grammy when it was judged. But that was a little tough. In connection with writing the lyric for Picnic, the theme from the famous movie Picnic, there again the title was a given, and it's not a good title. It's only one word, and it conveys nothing except the image of a picnic. If somebody said, to any songwriter, write a song about a picnic, they would have come up with a thought, a phrase. I met you at the picnic, or can't wait to see you at the picnic. You know, all we had was picnic. There's a word like chair or bread or something, gave me nothing. But nevertheless, I was stuck with that, so I had to work within those confines. And it turned out nicely. I worked with the melody, of course.
Yeah. Did you have the storyline?
No. That raises an interesting question. If you're writing the theme for a film, or there's already a famous novel or a famous play with the title, are you obliged as lyricists to somehow incorporate reference to the theme? And the answer is no, you're not. I hadn't even seen the movie by the time I wrote the thing, so I didn't know what it was. And it didn't matter. I knew that some action took place at a picnic, or the play wouldn't have been called that. The thing came up recently when I wrote a theme for Sidney Sheldon's novel. If it's ever made into a picture, presumably they'll use it. His new novel is titled Tell Me Your Dreams. So I started with that title. But my lyric has nothing to do with the story of his novel, which is about a woman with multiple personalities.
Oh,
So a psychiatrist would be interested in her dreams, of course.
I see. If you sit and write a tune that's really meant to be an instrumental, much as the thing you did with Benny Goodman or something like that, is it sometimes a little chore to think of a title to put on it?
That also is a marvelous question. That's what you do for a living. That's a marvelous question. I jump back to, I don't know, about 40 years ago. I once got intrigued by that question, just abstractly, and I wrote to about 20 band leaders, including Benny, long before I'd met him. He had some instrumentals. One was called Benji's Bubble, and another one with the name of one of his daughters. And I didn't know that those were named after two of his children until he wrote back and said, "Dear Steve, in answer to your question, Benji is one of my sons." So it's his own name, Benny, Benjamin. And I forget what the other one had to do with. But anyway, he used the name of his two children. But I was noticing, or what I had originally noticed, I should say, was that there was really no meaning, nor could there be any meaning to a pure melody. You might somehow think of a message if you hear a march or something of that sort, but that's your own interpretation, and 1,000 people would have 1,000 separate interpretations. You can't say a note means a word or a thought. Or if you do, you're talking nonsense. So anyway, to get back to your earlier question, all of the ways that there are to write songs, I work in. Sometimes I just start with a title. One of my hit songs, in fact, just last night I was listening to 3 different recordings of it, doing some organization work. It's called Pretend You Don't See Her, My Heart. It was a big hit for Jerry Vale, and it's been sung by Vic Damone and a lot of good singers. It's a very Italian waltz, purposely written in the Italian vein. It was originally written, in fact, no, it was recorded as an instrumental, but it was always in the Italian groove. Anyway, what occurred to me first was the title. It obviously would relate to a broken love affair, and the question, oh, what will happen if I run into her or him or whatever? So pretend you don't see her. That would be the solution. Just don't get involved anymore. It's too late. Everything's too sad or whatever. So again, in that case then, starting with the title thought.
Yeah.
In other cases, in most cases, in fact, I have a melody first which has no meaning whatever, although it does have a mood. There is such a thing as really sad melodies. There are other things which are soaringly romantic melodies, at least to American ears or Western European ears. What an Eskimo would think of when if he heard Rhapsody in Blue, we'll have to ask him, I don't know.
Let me play a little excerpt from one of your many songs, and we're talking about some of your jazz work.
Oh, yeah.
You recall doing that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I even remember where I was when I wrote that one.
No kidding.
Yeah, I was at a house I lived in for a few years in Van Nuys, I think it was, a subsection of Los Angeles. I had an inferior piano. I don't know how I acquired that, but it was an old upright. But the fellow you hear playing the clarinet, very good clarinetist, a marvelous guy named Gus Pavona, who made some big band recordings with his own group. Gus was one of those rare people who the meeting of which I recall clearly. And that's odd because I don't remember how I met most of my friends. My mother, yes, I think I can safely assume that we got together that way. But other than that, I just have a vague memory. I remember we went to the same high school or worked at the same hot dog stand or whatever. We got, brought us together. But the first moment of confrontation I have no recollection of, except for Gus. I had moved away from another little house and had one of those U-Haul trucks. So I pulled up to this new house and nobody's with me, so I had to get all the stuff out of the truck myself and begin lugging it into the house. And suddenly this friendly guy comes walking across the street, and he didn't know who I was because I was just on the radio then. I wasn't recognizable. And he said, "Hi, need any help?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." So he helped me for the next hour or so to carry chairs and things into the house. And that was Gus Pavona. We were friends
Nice.
until he passed away a year or so ago. Marvelous guy. Anyway, I remember showing that to Gus shortly after I'd written it. This was at the same neighborhood. And I think I just called it Baby But You Did. The titles that I give melodies either make sense, sounds like a dumb category, or they don't. But even the ones that don't make sense in terms of some coherent thought I had in mind that I was trying to convey as a writer, do fit the melody. In fact, that is why I give them that at the moment of composition, because I can't read music, which means I can't write it down. We send tapes of my songs to other people who can't write songs but can put them on paper. Anyway, once I'd written ba-ba-doo-ba-doo-ba-doo, boo-ba-doo-ba-doo, I just thought of that phrase, "Baby, but you did," like somebody else did. But baby, but you did. So that's how that got a title.
You probably could have, if you wanted to, put a lyric to that. It might have taken a certain amount of manipulation with, maybe I have too many notes here, I need a few less for the syllables. And
Well, no, it's possible, actually, even if you have too many notes in an ideal sense, to nevertheless do that. The only time I can remember being, as we now say, challenged in doing so was when I made what still seems to me an astonishing discovery. To jump back to the beginning of the story, back about 1937 or 8, the Bob Crosby Dixieland Band, which is one of the very popular nationally popular bands of the 30s, which was right in the middle of the glorious golden age swing period, was working a lot in Chicago, and therefore they had a lot of airtime. They were on the radio quite a lot. And it's a composition concerning which I had something to say when poor Bob Haggart passed away. He was the bass player in that band, and he was a composer and arranger. A fellow named Ray Baduc, B-A-U-D-U-C, was the drummer. And anyway, the song was called the South Rampart Street Parade. I think it is. I can only talk about the melody because I wrote the lyric. I can praise the melody. I think it's the greatest Dixieland song of all time. It's not the most played. When the Saints Go Marching In is most played, but that's really a dumb melody. Think of it. Ba-dum-bum-boom, ba-dum-bum-bum. This is not great writing, folks. It swings, but it's not a great song. South Rampart Street is a magnificent melody. In fact, it's more than that. It is 8 separate melodies. So when the guys put that thing together, they were creating really a Dixieland symphony. So I wrote the song long before I had met them. I wrote the lyric, I should say. And when I finally met them on the show or someplace, I took occasion to say, "Guys, given that there are 8 separate melodies on that marvelous thing you wrote, who wrote what? Which of you wrote what?" Because there were then 3 other men's names on the sheet music. I
Uh-huh.
can't remember who the other names. I don't see those names anymore. I don't know why. You'd have to ask the historians how that got changed.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought maybe, one guy wrote this phrase and one guy wrote another, and it might indeed have been done that way. And I've never forgotten Ray Baduke's answer. He said, to tell you the truth, we're not certain that we wrote any of that stuff. He said, it's just a collection of Dixie licks, Dixie cliches that we have a vague recollection of hearing when we were kids, listening to those marvelous old Dixieland street bands, which they still preserve in New Orleans because of the cultural use, and it's nice for tourists to see that. But it was one of the places, as you know, where jazz actually got started. First of all, New Orleans is the general birthplace, not the only one, but it's number one. And there was that tradition of bands actually marching down the street in the sunshine, playing. Now, bands had been marching down the street for centuries, so that was not invented in New Orleans. But what they played generally was marches. And in this song, historians have, it's like finding the Dead Sea Scrolls in the context of jazz research. In that song, you have the word parade. It isn't just the South Rampart Street Jamboree or whatever. It's the South Rampart Street Parade. And consequently, it is partly martial. The reason I'm laughing now is I dictated that phrase the other day, and somebody wrote M-A-R-S-H-A-L-L.
I can see
As if it was part of the Marshall Plan. M-A-R-T-I-A-L, folks. Anyway, it was part of the march. And if you think of it, the very opening phrase is something the guys almost certainly did hear when they were 12 years old and kids and listening to that kind of music. Bum 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 ba-dum, bum 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 ba-dum, bum bum ja-dum, da-da-da-da-da-dum, bum 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 bum. Boy, that really makes you want to get up out of your chair and march, even with only my mouth singing it. It is magnificent composition. Anyway, because of its popularity and its greatness, now we jump from about 1937 to 1951. I was in New York. And one day I got to wondering, is there a lyric to that? Because I was also working as a lyricist as well as composer. And to my astonishment, when we checked with the publisher, he said no. Why the lyricists of our nation let that masterpiece hang unadorned with words for so long a time, I don't know, but it worked out nicely for me. So I wrote the melody. Now to get back to the word challenge. I'm the only person you can ask a question, you get backwards, I keep stepping away farther from the answer. Because it had 8 separate melodies and very busy notes, a lot of phrases with lots of syllables, it was therefore tough to write a lyric to. Most lyrics I write in, 25 minutes or so. That one took me a few days. In fact, I had to even resort to a technical gimmick to enable me to complete it that quickly, and that was that most records in those days were at the 78 revolutions per minute speed, as you know. Years later they invented 45 and stuff. But there were also certain turntables which, for the accommodation of radio stations, could play recordings at the speed of 33 1/3 revolutions per minute. So I discovered that if I could take this 78 record, which itself is a classic, well, anyway, it's that great, and play it at the slower speed, that helped me enormously, or would have helped any lyricist, because the notes were going by very slowly. So that saved me several hours' work once I stumbled on that idea.
Neat. The last thing I want to do is wrap up here, but I'm going to let you know the time. It's about 5 of 11. I don't know where you have to be.
That's okay. I can stay till about 8 after 11.
8 after. Okay. Can you define for me, when you hear something that's really swinging, why? Why does one thing swing and one thing and the next thing doesn't?
The dominant factor is rhythm. I think most people would think of that had they never been born. But that isn't all there is to it. There are certain ways of voicing instruments. If you're talking now, let's say, about a big band, 14, 15, 16 pieces, there are certain kinds of harmonies Uh, Sometimes, at least now it's so common we don't even notice it or comment on it, but sometime in the late 30s, you began to hear more chords, even if it's a simple chord, a C chord, let's say, where they added the sixth note of the scale instead of the tonic, the bum, 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 let's see, C, E, G. To those three notes, they added the A, which is the sixth note in the group. And why that sounds hipper or cooler, as they would say today, it's not easy to explain in purely scientific terms, but that's the way it is. That had probably happened first, even before it happened with instruments. It happened with voices. If you listen to trios or quartets, there were no five-group singing groups that I know about in the old days until the high-lows and group like that came along. They didn't get that complex with their harmonies. But we all remember the term barbershop quartet.
Yeah.
Down by the old mill stream. That's nice stuff. But the harmonies are as simple as possible. Only the necessary notes are there. There's no enrichment or adornment. But then, about 1937-ish or so, a group called the Merry Macs. If you can find any other old recordings, play them sometime with this comment. You'll see what I'm talking about. They were the first people to add the sixth and to add other harmonic enrichments. Where they got them, I don't know. You'd have to dig them out of the grave and ask them, I guess. But you can hear it in their old recordings. Then from the Merry Macs, that opened a window of opportunity. I'm very big with cliches today. And you had a group like the Pied Pipers, the Mellow Larks. Mel Torme had a great group, the Mel Tones, I think they were called, in which the harmonies were more typical of what was also happening at that time in voicing the reed sections, the saxophone sections of orchestras. When they only had four notes, they could still put in the sixth and some enrichments, but when they added a fifth saxophone, which now all the big bands have had for years, somehow that enlarged the harmonic possibilities, and we associated that kind of harmonic hipness with big band, with jazz, with swing. Parenthetically, isn't it marvelous that young people now love that music?
Yeah.
I sometimes feel like saying, hey, where were you a year ago? I tried to tell you it was great.
Yeah.
But you had to wait for some guy to have a hit record with it.
Uh-huh.
It's okay.
Yeah. Your new book.
Oh, yes.
I wanted to, if you wouldn't mind handing it to me.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called Dump. It touches on music, chiefly lyric writing of popular songs. What the problem deals with what the book deals with is the problem that the American people have for quite some time now been getting dumber. I don't mean I think so. I mean they have been. Had they never been born. This is just a factual statement. It's all too sadly documented. We hear constantly horror stories about individual schools. And it's more than awful. It's even internationally embarrassing. Americans get very excited and sometimes very disrespectful, very cruel, if we send to the Olympics, wherever they're held, a guy who is demonstrably the fastest 100-meter runner in our country. What an honor that is. Wouldn't you be honored if you were the fastest miler in the whole United States? Fantastic. Your name would be in the books. Nevertheless, to be the fastest in the States doesn't mean you're also going to beat all the guys from Africa and Sweden and Cleveland and so forth. Anyway, if an American only gets the silver medal or the bronze, that's nice, but we treat him as if he's almost a failure.
Yeah.
Okay, now carry that mindset, forget sports, apply it to information, apply it to education. Now, when the American students, about geography, history, math, science, whatever, when they're in an Olympic race, or the equivalent of it, with about 20 or 30 other nations, we all know the nations, France, Sweden, Germany, boom, all those nations. Here's the scary part. We not only don't win the gold, the silver, or the bronze, we usually come in last. if that isn't scary bad news, and I'm not talking about meaningless hooray for America. Sure, hooray for every country. I don't give a damn about that. But just in terms of what kind of doctors are we going to produce? What kind of automobile manufacturers are going to produce? A lot of very practical questions. What kind of airplane pilots? We're taking them from the worst of the international competition, the guys who almost flunked out. So anyway, that is the large issue that my book deals with. And it gets into evidences of Dumpf in the lyrics of many popular songs.
I think I was making a scene on the plane on the way here, because I was reading, especially in the beginning, some of your examples, and I'm laughing out loud, and of course the people around me are kind of wondering what's going on, and I probably was advertising your book pretty well.
Oh,
actually.
great.
And I wanted to comment on the thing you said about 45 minutes ago, actually, when you were, which I think is significant, when you were describing the golden age, and you called it world music. I think that's a very telling statement, and I think something, you know, when you go to the record stores today, you can see a category of world music, but it's all, you know, from Taiwan or music from Indonesia. But
right.
we had...
Well, you're right. The music today, there's a sense in which America still dominates culturally, but it's not because of great quality anymore. It's because rock was in, or punk rock was in for about a year. You know, acid rock was in. There are many subdivisions of garbage music. But that those truly golden days when, even if you grew up in anywhere on the planet, you know, a village in Latin America, you still loved those beautiful Gershwin melodies, those beautiful Jerome Kern melodies.
Do you think it's odd that jazz is being touted in many regards as a great American art form, yet you can't go out and hear it unless it's at a special concert or if you want to pay $50 to get into a club?
Yeah, that's true. It's also even worse than that fact, and you're right to bring it up, is the fact that American jazz musicians, the well-known, the highly competent among them, can work in France, can work in Germany, can work in Sweden and many other parts of the world, Australia, whatever, and be treated the way we treat the Beatles when they would come here. Crowds meet them at the airport. People stand in line for 2 hours to get into the clubs where they play in these world capitals. But right here tonight in Los Angeles, some of the guys are playing, and there's 8 people out front at the tables. These same musicians playing genius stuff, which later, if it's recorded tonight, even with 12 people in the audience, that record may, you know, win a Grammy 2 years down the line. So the stuff is there. The treasures are there. But it's not that much appreciated, particularly since that 1950 point when American teenagers just suddenly veered away. And we could talk about that as we already have at some length.
Yeah. Well, just to wrap up, what we expect from you in the near future?
Well, more of the same. One of the things I do is write books, and this is one of them. It's my 52nd book, and there are about 4 more that are ready to be published, the only one of which is relevant to your interests is one titled 100 Lyrics by Steve Allen. It's obviously doesn't have melodies in it, although we're thinking of sending it out with a recording of some kind so people can hear some of the stuff. But it just features the lyrics, and in each case, after printing the lyric, then we tell the story of how it came to be written, or why, or who I wrote it with, or whatever the story might be, for a movie, for a Broadway musical, for what have you. Then I'm constantly doing performances. I have a big band that is as good as any big band anywhere. I'm not saying I am, I'm saying the guys are, and they are. Once you reach a certain level of expertise, it's almost the same as in athletics. Michael Jordan is better than Shaquille O'Neal, but just a little bit, you know. So once guys are that great, they can play in any band. I don't have them under contract, but every time we send out the call, we get 15 or 16 of the best players on earth.
Yeah.
So the albums we're making and the concerts we're doing are wild. If you dig that kind of music, you'll have a very happy evening, I mean, out front.
I love the longevity that's possible in music too, with the players. You
Oh,
know,
yeah.
I feel sorry for dancers sometimes. They have a certain
Yes.
point that they can get to, but
Yeah.
you know, some of our greatest players are.
A very wise observation on your part. The same thing is true of actors. Depending on the kind of acting they do, time can be cruel to them. If what they chiefly market, if what chiefly explains their success is their physical beauty or handsomeness, they're not always going to have it. But you can be 74 years old and be playing jazz is probably better than you did at 54 or 24. You know more.
Yeah.
And I used to think that at least you would lose your chops, you know, your technical facility as you got old. But I'm now 77, and I play at least as good at this age as I did at any earlier age. So speaking personally, I haven't lost anything. In fact, I, as a composer, am considerably better now than back when I was writing a lot of my songs that were hits. Because you don't have to be Beethoven, as we've already established, to write a popular song. But harmonically, I'm much more advanced now, and so I'm writing more unusual melodies,
Right.
despite my age.
Well, I'm most appreciative of your time, and it's been
Well,
a
you should be at these
fascinating-
prices. No, I'm honored to be invited, because what we're laying down here, what you guys are establishing, preserving in your library is very important.
Good.
Because while it's fun to be 77 years old, we're not going to be around for a great deal longer.
Right.
And oh, here comes death now. I'll be running away.
We better sign off then. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.